Good evening, everybody. Welcome to History Author Talks. I'm Roger Williams, and I am your host for this evening. And I wanted to welcome you all. I know it's been a few weeks. I've been busy. As you, most of you know, I do a lot of public history work, and I've had a lot of programming that I've been doing. I've been giving a lot of tours through my through 10crucialdays.org. And I also have a day job. So I've been busy with my publishing business. So I've been a little busy, so sorry I've been away. But we've got a great show for you this evening. And I'm very excited, and I hope that you will be too. I want to remind everybody before we even start that our authors' books are available at historyauthortalks.com bookshop. You just go to the little bookshop and you'll be able to find his books in the bookshop under his name. And we also want to remind you that the portion of the proceeds go to the SAR library in Louisville, Kentucky, the Sons of the American Revolution Library. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce you to Christian McBurney. Christian was raised in Kingston, Rhode Island, in a home that was built in 1809. In high school, he wrote a book on the history of Kingston, Rhode Island, and he graduated from Brown University in 1981. At Brown, he wrote a 300-page undergraduate history thesis on colonial South Kingston Planter Society. After graduating from New York University Law School in 1985, he embarked on a career as an attorney. He's a partner at Arndt Fox in Washington, D.C. He and his wife live in Maryland, where they raised their 3 kids. He renewed his interest in history by writing the adult version of that History of Kingston, which was published in 2004. And with that, I am pleased to add to the screen here, Christian McBurney. Welcome, Christian. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks for having me.
So I love having you tell us a little bit first before we get into the book for tonight. Tell us a little bit about your first book that you wrote in high school and your progression of all of the books that you've written. I've got, but here I can let folks know that we have Spies in Revolutionary Rhode Island, Abductions in the American Revolution, Kidnapping the Enemy, Untold Stories of World War II in Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Campaign, George Washington's Nemesis, the outrageous treason and unfair court-martial of General Charles Lee. And the book for tonight is Dark Voyage. So tell us how you came to write all of these wonderful books.
Well, in your introduction, you kind of touched on it. I did, amazingly enough, at age 16, write a book in the history of my hometown, Kingston, Rhode Island, which was actually the county seat for 150 years and one of the rotating capitals of Rhode Island for 100 years. So some interesting things happened there. That I had children, and then suddenly my children didn't want to play with me anymore. So I said, gosh, what am I going to do with my time? Hey, I'll do the adult version of A History of Kingston. So I did that. And then I said, all right, that was pretty good. Now what do I do? Well, I like Rhode Island history. I like American Revolution. What's the most important thing that happened in Rhode Island? The Rhode Island Campaign, the Battle of Rhode Island in August 1778. So when the French and the Americans got together and tried to take over Newport, it didn't succeed. But the battle was a very interesting one, and I did a book on that, which is the authoritative one on that topic at this point. So I finished that and said, well, what was the second best thing that happened in Rhode Island during the war? And I had to work with that one. It was the capture of Richard Prescott by a Rhode Island's William Barton. He did it because he wanted a major general to exchange for Charles Lee, who had been captured in New Jersey at Basking Ridge. So I made a combined story about those 2 captures, and I think it's my best written book in terms of there's a high points, and then the guy from Rhode Island kind of got too arrogant and had some low points, but at the end he had a high point. So it's a fun book.
Well, you say it was your best written. I think they're all excellent stories, and you write a great narrative. And then you came upon Dark Voyage. Now, Dark Voyage, the subtitle is The American Privateers' War and the British African Slave Trade. Timely for sure. And in your introduction, you talk about the economy of what we're talking about in this story. So tell us a little bit about how you came to this thesis of Dark Voyage.
Well, I'd always been interested in slavery, and Rhode Island, turns out, was the dominant slave trading colony of all the 13 colonies. So I was aware of that. But what really happened was I was at the Williamsburg conference that Bruce Venter puts on.
Mm-hmm.
And I was listening to a presentation by Dennis Conrad of the Naval History and Heritage Command on the latest volume of the Naval Documents of the Revolution. And he mentioned this privateer that had sailed to Africa to attack British slave trade forts and ships. And it came from Rhode Island. So they were all like, ding, 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 I know what my next book is going to be.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about slavery. Well, we're going to talk a lot about slavery tonight, but so we are famously written that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Explain what men were in 1775 and 1776.
Sure. I like to, in my introduction to the book, I talk about, there was a glaring contrast at this time. At the one hand, it was a glorious struggle for the American Revolution, for the ideas of individual liberty and equality and dignity of the individual. And you read the Declaration of Independence's words. They resonate today in Ukraine. The word men originally was intended to apply to adult white men. But over time, with the Supreme Court, it has been extended to women and persons of all creeds and colors. So, those are gifts that the American Revolution bestowed on the world. On the other hand, at that time, what was going on in 1775, with the Battle of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, at that time, it was the zenith of the slave trade, or Great Britain's slave trade. And it was one of the worst tragedies in world history. Over 90,000 African captives were being transported from Africa across to the Caribbean every year. It wasn't just Great Britain, it was Portugal was number one overall. They started a lot earlier than Great Britain and ended a lot later than Great Britain. But at this time, Great Britain was the leading slave trading country in the world. So in one sense, it's, they're the bad guy of the book.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the causes of the revolution a little bit. So we all learn in our textbooks, it's no taxation without representation, but then you also had the Proclamation of 1763 and Dunmore's Proclamation in 1775. Wasn't the war really just about commerce?
Well, I'd say there was a number of causes. Well, first of all, I will want to say, hey, this is a book about slavery. Do I really want to read it? And the people who are here now, I think they've decided, they want to understand more about it. My focus is on the slave trade, not slavery. And so in many senses, the slave trade was even worse than slavery, if that's possible. And I think it's important to understand because this was going on at the time of the American Revolution. And if you really want to understand the American Revolution, you have to look at what was going on at that time in America and the world and in Great Britain. What was your question again, Roger?
Well, what I was bringing out was that it wasn't just about taxation or
right.
it was
I
really,
would say it was primarily.
their conversation was about commerce.
Yeah, well, I'd
And
say it was
slavery is a part of
primarily.
that commerce.
Yeah, I'd say it was primarily, the Revolutionary War was primarily caused by Americans did not want to be taxed without their consent. And also American merchants did not want regulation on their trade. With actually a lot of the best trade was with the Caribbean islands. But there were other causes too. In general, the Americans understandably didn't want to be told what to do by Britain in all sorts of life, various varieties of life. And one of those was the African slave trade. The Americans actually, this was the first, they actually wanted to prohibit importations of more African slaves for a variety of reasons. In the North, it was more for humane reasons. In the South, it was more, they were worried about slave rebellions, or, let's maintain the prices of the enslaved people we have, not bring in more. But in all cases, Britain refused and revoked laws to prohibit or limit the slave trade of the importations of African captives. So you could say, yeah, that was one of the causes of the war. I wouldn't say it was a huge one, but it was one of many where, hey, Americans say, look, we want to control our own destiny.
So anyone who's ever seen the Betsy Ross flag knows that there were 13 original colonies. Well, in the Western Hemisphere, there were 26 colonies. What made those 13 different than the other 13?
The slave trade and sugar.
There you go. Sugar.
Those colonies were all had plantations that made sugar. Sugar on its own was very important to England and Europe. Before the 17th century, Europeans didn't even know about sugar. But English people in particular, they loved their sugar in their, their coffee, their tea, cookies and cakes, even today. But for many years, until 1820, sugar was the most important import into Britain, far exceeding tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, and rice and indigo from South Carolina.
So, of course, we also had those other colonies of Nova Scotia and Quebec, and they didn't have the sugar, but still
they lost money. They lost
money. Exactly. So I know it's absolutely revolting to talk about one kind of slavery over another, but what was the difference between the British Caribbean plantation slavery versus the slavery in the 13 colonies?
Well, slavery was really, for one, it was indispensable to the sugar plantations. And the reason was that these plantations need a constant influx of new African captives in order to maintain their slave populations and to continue and work on their plantations. Slaves worked in gangs, they planted, they harvested, and most gruelingly, they converted sugar into sugarcane. And because the planters rotated their crops, the harvest time and the conversion of sugarcane into sugar was over a 6-month period. And then, these slaves would have to work, 12 to 16 hours a day, that kind of thing. But what was really different from America was the horrible conditions that they worked in and the high death rate. The death rate was astonishing in the Caribbean. The enslaved people came over already weakened and vulnerable to disease because of a long voyage in the Middle Passage, 6 weeks, on a hold with hardly any air, smells, not much, very good food. And then when they land, they're subject to a new food, new work conditions, new environment, and that's called the seasoning period. In that three-year period, about 20% died in that alone. So an outstanding feature of the British Caribbean was that the planters intentionally decided it's cheaper to buy enslaved captives from Africa each year than to pay to improve the living conditions of the slaves that we have already purchased. So it's just shocking. So that therefore there was a high death rate and they needed to, constantly replenish their slave stock by getting more African captives in the slave trade. One interesting, Adam Hochschild said that he compared the numbers of slaves who survived to captives who were brought over when slavery was prohibited. So in the United States, when it ended, 1865, there were less than 500,000 enslaved people brought to North America. But by then there were 4 million who were alive. It's, natural birth, that's pretty good. By comparison, when slavery ended the British Caribbean in 1834, total slave imports of well over 2 million resulted in 1834 in only 670,000 African Caribbeans alive.
It's almost the complete opposite.
Yeah, just
Yeah. I mean, more than the complete opposite. That's that is absolutely stark. That's amazing statistic.
Yeah.
So you make the point that America played a comparatively small role in the African slave trade, and that more of the enslaved persons came from Rhode Island slavers. You said that at the onset. Why? Tell the audience about how this was. Why was this why Rhode Island? Tell us about the rum men.
Sure. Well, yeah, as you said, the United States played a comparatively small role. In colonial times, they carried about 2.4% of the total slaves carried in the Atlantic slave trade overall. Well, that's pretty small. But it gets to be a large number, if you look at it each year. Now, of that amount, Rhode Island was clearly the dominant colony in terms of slave trading. And Newport in particular was about 90% of what Rhode Island did in the colonial times. And not clear why, probably because New York, Charleston, Boston, they had pretty good hinterlands. They could draw on lots of farms deep into the interior. Rhode Island was small, it couldn't really do that. So they looked around and said, well, it's kind of interesting. We can buy molasses from the Caribbean, bring it back to Newport, distill it into rum. We can sell the rum to New Englanders, they like to drink, but we still have an excess amount. Turns out the best market for it was to sell the rum to, in exchange for African captives in the slave trade. And they were called, so when American Rhode Island ship captains arrived on the Gold Coast of Africa, they were called rum men. It was the liquor of choice among the African intermediaries. Now, these African intermediaries are the ones mostly who traded with the white European and American slave ship captains. So, typically the slaves would be captured in a war, in a raid in the interior, and then brought to the coast where intermediaries would purchase them. And then those African intermediaries would sell to the white slave ship captains. Sometimes they would sell to the British slave forts, and the British slave forts would then collect captives. And then when a passing British ship came by, they could sell them all at once. And that was a lot better for slave ship captains, because the more time you spent on the African coast, the more slaves would die, less money you would make.
Right.
And so they wanted to get in and out of there as quickly as possible.
So just a couple of little programming note here. If you've missed anything that Christian's outlined for us here, this program is being recorded. You can certainly go back and hear what he had to say, but of course the idea, we hope, is that you'll also pick up a copy of Dark Voyage and actually read the book. And if you have any questions, certainly use the chat feature to ask your questions, which we can get to during the question and answer period. One of the main theses of your work is, well, I should say first, this is a great, in essence, this is a great story. I mean, you've got a great sea adventure story here, but one of the main theses of your work is that the American Revolution was a crucial catalyst for the worldwide anti-slavery movement? Explain.
Sure. Before the American Revolution, there was almost no anti-slavery activity anywhere in the world. In England, the anti-slavery movement didn't really get going until 1787 with Thomas Clarkson. There was the Mansfield case, which said that any black person, in effect, as it was applied, any black person in England would be free. But that didn't have any impact in the Caribbean or in North America. So suddenly, the American Revolution, hey, we're fighting for our liberties. So often you hear these patriot leaders say, the British are trying to enslave us. We'll be as if we were slaves, just the worst thing possible. And eventually, they looked around and said, wait a minute, we are actually enslaving some people here. So maybe that's not such a good thing. And you started hearing among orators and writers of influence some anti-slavery activity. For example, James Otis, and his famous pamphlet in 1763, he was writing about, hey, we shouldn't be taxed without representation in Parliament. And he said, acts of Parliament, there's something more important than acts of Parliament, and that is, natural law. For example, white people and black people should be treated the same. And wow, where did that come from? And then he started saying, opposing the African slave trade. Another one was John Allen. He was a Boston preacher, Congregationalist preacher. And after the Gaspee incident, which the Gaspee was burned to the ground by John Brown and some other Rhinelanders, he called it, a very, noble act of resistance against British tyranny. And then in the fourth edition, he added, oh, by the way, slavery is really bad and the African slave trade is horrible. So, wow, So you're starting to hear a lot more of that, not only in New England, but Benjamin Rush in Pennsylvania, even Richard Henry Lee. You're starting to hear this from some planters who actually owned slaves, like Richard Henry Lee and Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, who was very anti-slave trade. Mason was interesting because he was very much against the slave trade throughout his life, but he was not against slavery. So he was one of the only ones who took that position.
So in your research in the First and Second Continental Congress, we've talked about how revolution was a lot about commerce. Explain how the early debate and these early abolitionists, mostly New England figures, debated the issue of slavery in the First and Second Continental Congress.
Well, in the First Continental Congress, that was basically the main provision was let's do an economic boycott against Britain, so we can help our brethren in Boston who have been suffering because after the Tea Party, the Boston port was closed and other bad things were imposed on Boston. So it was pretty impressive that the rest of the 13 colonies said this could happen to us too. We need to stand together. And an economic boycott of importing British goods was eventually imposed November 1774. But the second provision of that was, we will not participate in the slave trade. Wow. Okay. I would have understood if they said we won't buy slaves from Great Britain, but they went much further. Said we don't want anything to do with the slave trade. So that was interesting, pretty impressive. Now that ended in April 1776. So at that point, American merchants were not allowed to engage in any slave trading with the British countries or colonies. But they could, in theory, work with France or Spain or other countries, although that was pretty impractical. Pretty much the American slave trade ended during the Revolutionary War. So
now we get to the story part of Dark Voyage, and you focus on the journeys of the privateer.
I guess, I'm sorry, Roger, to interrupt. I do one thing I want to add is, by the end of the war, all northern states had ended slavery. All northern states prior to the war had enslaved people in their midst. So these colonies were not dominated by slaves like the South were. It was an important particularly economically, but every colony had slaves. New York had quite a few, Pennsylvania had a good number, and Rhode Island had the highest percentage in New England. But after the war, it all ended. And it was a direct result of the American Revolution. So that was one of the most impressive, important anti-slavery events in the history of anti-slavery movement. Now, unfortunately, in the South, slavery continued. So we know what happened there with the cotton gin and expanded. And unfortunately, we had a civil war. But for a moment there, it looked like it was a possibility to be able to eradicate slavery, but it did not happen.
Now, you said all northern states. It was really all New England states because there was still slavery in the Middle Atlantic.
Well, there was, but Pennsylvania ended in 1780. A lot of states said, hey, we don't want to create waves with the South. Let's wait till after the war to end slavery. They intended to all along. So Rhode Island, Connecticut, for example, in 1784, a year after the war ended, enacted gradual abolition. Pennsylvania went as far as during the war. They did passed gradual abolition in 1780. And as you know, your great state of Vermont,
Absolutely.
when they were formed as a 14th state, they put in their constitution they did not allow slavery.
So I'm showing the audience here. I guess Christian picked up on it. I'm wearing my Vermont shirt here. This patch on my shoulder is my family were found one of the first families of Vermont, and I haven't been able to determine this yet, but I know that my ancestors actually were in Windsor when they were drafting the Vermont Constitution, which was the first to outlaw slavery in its constitution. Of course, it wasn't a state then, but it is it's something that I'm still trying to research. So I was starting to say, let's get to the action here in Dark Voyage, because there is a lot. While we've had a lot of conversations here about commerce and sugar and political theory and what our founders were thinking, this book's got a lot of action in it, and you use the Rhode Island privateer, the Marlborough, was really as the vehicle for your story, and the Marlborough's voyages to West Africa. Give us the highlight. What should we know about the Marlborough and how it came to be and what the stories are here?
Yeah, I mean, most of the book is about that voyage and how it started, and then about the actual voyage to the West Coast and dealing with African locals and British slave traders and the like. So it's certainly is I think it's very interesting and novel history. But it starts with privateering. The Marlborough was a privateer. And privateers were not pirates. They were sanctioned by governments. They were required to attack enemy shipping. They had to treat prisoners humanely, or else they might lose their prize or commission. It really starts with John Brown of Providence, Rhode Island. So he was one of the most important merchants in Rhode Island. His family, Brown family, of course, that's who Brown University is named after, his family, but not him in particular. He was the leader of the Gaspee, burning of the Gaspee event in 1772. But in 1776 and 1777, they really got rich privateering, investing in privateers. The way privateering generally worked is that investors would invest and buy a privateer, outfit it, and then it would be crewed by the captains and the officers and the crew. If they got a prize, they would bring the prize back to a safe port. Providence had an admiralty court, so it would go through admiralty procedures. If a jury, anyone here could have been on a jury and said, "Hey, is this prize a valid prize? Was it an enemy ship?" And were all the rules followed? And if the answer is yes, then the prize would be sold, the ship and the cargo would be sold at auction. And the investors would get 50%, and the captain and the officers and crew would get the other 50%. They would agree to an articles of agreement beforehand about how they would split it among themselves. Brown, for example, early on, it was amazing how New England privateers and American privateers, 1776 and early 1777, just captured a lot of British merchant ships out of the Caribbean, carrying back huge amounts of sugar, or off the Canadian coast, carrying, military supplies. I did the Rhode Island campaign book. There was the siege of Rhode Island, one of the only sieges in the war. And the Americans brought over some pretty impressive cannon, including some huge mortars. Well, where did they get those mortars? They didn't make them in any iron foundry. They weren't capable of doing that. They captured them from British warships and supply ships, and then took them to Springfield, Massachusetts Armory. And then when they were ready to be used in the Rhode Island siege, they were brought over by oxen. So Brown, for example, had this one ship called the Diamond. It only carried 6 guns, had 30 or 40 men, but it captured more than 8 merchant ships that were 200 tons or more, each one on the average worth about 8,000 pounds. It only cost Brown about 3,300 pounds to buy and outfit the Diamond, and yet one ship that he brought in would, on the average, worth about 8,000 pounds. So you could see how profitable it was, and he shared in 12 different prizes. So, but things changed. The British Navy finally got wise. Hey, we're going to start putting merchant ships in convoys. The Royal Navy was easily the most powerful maritime force in the world at that time. So their 32-gun frigates could defeat any privateer that was ever put out there. So Brown had a lot of profits, and he said, well, I've got all these profits. I'd like to invest in a new privateer, but small privateers aren't going to handle it anymore. I need a bigger privateer. But if I send it to the Caribbean or off the Canadian coast, it's got a good chance of being captured. What am I going to do? Well, how about if I send it to Africa? Africa, no one ever sent a privateer to Africa. That's crazy. And why would Brown even think that? Well, one reason is Rhode Island was the dominant slave trading colony in terms of slave trading. So when slave traders came back to Rhode Island, Brown could interview them, and he would ask, are there any British patrols of warships on the African coast protecting the British slave trading posts and British slave ships? And the answer was no. The British Navy was overstretched. It was carrying the British Army in North America as part of the war. It was trying to blockade some ports, including Newport, New York. It was trying to attack privateers. Most importantly, it was making sure that guarding against a possible invasion by France over the English Channel. So they didn't have a lot of ships to spare to send to Africa. Another reason that Brown thought of it was that he actually was an investor in 2 slave voyages out of Providence. One of them turned out to be one of the deadliest in the history of North American slave trading. The captain was Esek Hopkins, the future commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. Hopkins had no experience as a slave trading captain, but I guess the Browns couldn't find one who had experience, so they asked Hopkins to do it. But unfortunately, out of 196 slaves that Hopkins purchased, 109 died. A lot of them from disease. He spent so much time buying them in small amounts. He was relatively inexperienced. There was a mutiny. Some were killed there. So it was really a horrible cruise. And the Browns lost money in that one. But because of that experience, Brown wasn't daunted by sending a ship to Africa. One reason you might be concerned about sending a ship to Africa is you've got all these goods that you want to trade, but you can't put too much food and water in there. It's such a long voyage, you can't possibly put enough food and water for the entire voyage. So you actually have to trade some of your merchandise with African chieftains to get food and water. That could be a little daunting to somebody from Salem or Newburyport. but not to someone from Rhode Island. They were used to that.
So Michael wants to know a little bit more about the Marlborough itself. How big is it?
Yeah,
Crew,
yeah,
cannon, gun, what kind of guns did it have?
sure. It was about, it was 250 tons, had 20 guns. We don't know exactly what caliber ones they had, probably mostly 6 and 9 pounders and a few 12 pounders thrown in. It wound up getting some deck guns later from some of the captures it made. And it had a crew ideally of 125, but it never had more than 92 as a crew. But that's a pretty big crew. So it's a pretty impressive ship.
So
there's a beautiful picture of it in the book.
In the book,
From
yeah.
a model of in Hamburg, Germany. That's probably what it looked like.
Right. So Robert wants to know, did the American privateers raid French or Spanish slave ships before they officially joined the American cause in 78, 79?
Absolutely not. The Americans were trying to make allies of the France and Spain. So the last thing they would want to do is try to alienate France and Spain. It reminds me of one interesting small affair, but the Marlborough landed first in West Africa at Gorée Island, well known for slave trading, owned by France. And the captain, George Babcock, said, "Hey, we'd like to spend a few days here, refit. You can sell us some fresh water. And you could also tell us where we could go attack Britain." And the French governor said, "No, no, no, no. We don't want to, provoke Britain into a war, just because of what I do. So you have to leave in 24 hours. I'm very sorry. We'll give you some fresh, we'll sell you some fresh water." So France was also very concerned about starting a war at that point. They didn't realize that France had already declared war.
Well, with Brown sending the Marlborough to the African coast, wasn't necessarily for just altruistic reasons. This was no, enlightenment quest to help these unfortunate captives. What was his real motive?
Absolutely not. I think he was, privateering you had mixed motives. The first motive is to harm the enemy and help your own country. And the privateers definitely harmed Britain and helped America. America gained arms, gunpowder was in short supply. They gained a lot of gunpowder, various military supplies, food. So it was important to the American cause, bringing in all those items. On the other hand, they were in it for profit. 50% would be shared by the captain and the crew. So these guys could have joined the Continental Army or the Continental Navy, but I'm convinced that even though they were patriots and wanted to hurt the enemy, they were primarily interested in making money.
This is also the problem that the American Navy had. They couldn't get sailors. You pay these poor sailors get such low pay, whereas if you're a privateer, you can make some real money. Exactly.
Everyone had dollar signs in their eyes, especially after the big gains early on, but it was more difficult after that for sure. But in this case, they were going to Africa. So Brown hoped we would like to sack and plunder a British slave fort. These slave forts were intended to make slave trading easier for British slave ships. So they would bring a lot of the merchandise from Britain that were used to trade for slaves in Africa: guns, gunpowder, textiles, porcelain, all sorts of goods. So if the Americans sacked a slave port, they would get a lot of these goods, and that's exactly what happened. And then also Brown hoped that there could be some slaves held at the fort, because the idea was to collect captives in these forts and then sell them en masse to passing British slave ships. In addition, Brown hoped that he could capture British slave ships with slaves on board. And then if he was really successful, he would capture a slave ship that was all slave, meaning it was full of captives and ready to sail to the Caribbean, and the British sailors were all going to cash in.
Huh.
And then you could really cash in by capturing the ship. And the idea, of course, was they would capture the ship, put a prize crew on there, a small crew, sail it back to French Caribbean island, ideally, where they could sell their captives, or Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, where they could sell the captives, and they could make money. So it was, in effect, these guys were becoming slave traders themselves. So that's, even then it was pretty bad, and by today's standards, that's repugnant.
So did crews of these British slavers just say, we'll give up, can we be part of your privateer crew?
No, that was definitely one of the most interesting things about the story on the African coast. Babcock, the captain, and the Marlborough did capture a number of British slave ships with slaves on board. A number of them were kind of small-time slave traders. And invariably, these guys would say, hey, I'll cooperate with you. I'll give you intelligence. And Babcock said, well, if you do that, I'll give you your ship back. So they all cooperated with an American patriot. It was treason. It was outright treason. And they really did provide good information. Pilots, you might want to sack this slave trading post over here. I heard there was this ship, all slave, ready to go. You might want to go get that one. So it was pretty remarkable. They were just in it for the money. They didn't care about patriotism.
So with the Marlborough engaged in all these actions off the coast of Africa, you mentioned Hopkins, who to me is rather a sad character in our history. But where there must have been others involved. Tell us about some of the other crews and captains that were involved in this.
The Marlborough is the only privateer I know of that sailed to Africa and made captures. Early in the war, some privateers did go over there and they bought gunpowder. Because the British slave ships, one of their most popular products was gunpowder, so that the African warriors could engage in their wars. So the privateers knew that, so they went to Africa and bought some of the gunpowder from the local chieftains, willing to pay a little higher price.
Right.
So Britain tried to put a stop to that. But one of the interesting figures I came across was John Paul Jones. He actually wrote to, Robert Morris. Congress, one of the secret committee head. And John Paul Jones said, hey, I'd like to lead an expeditionary force to Africa. At the time, he was in Newport, Rhode Island, October 1776. And I think we would do a lot of damage there. But it never got off the ground. And but again, Jones knew what he was talking about because he had experience in the slave trade. His first 2 jobs as a sailor were on slave trading voyages. One of them was, the first one was out of Whitehaven, England, where he was born and raised.
Wow. So a lot of members of the audience for History Author Talks are avid readers of the American Revolution, and we've all read multiple biographies and books about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr and Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox and Daniel Morgan. And tell us about George Waite Babcock.
Sure. He was, I think, one of the top privateer captains of the war, although he's some books on privateering, he's not even mentioned once. I do go through, after the Marlborough, a number of his other voyages. He never backed down from attacking enemy ships. So he fought 5 engagements with enemy ships, including a couple that were larger than his and had more firepower. One of the ships was a Royal Navy sloop that he forced to retreat. And the most famous one was a British privateer out of Northern Ireland. It had more cannon and more men. Babcock's ship was reduced because he made so many captures, that the prize crews would reduce the numbers on his ship. But he slugged it out with this British privateer and forced the surrender, killed the captain, and definitely inflicted more damage. So that was an impressive win. So he was, but he was a sensible too. He was not crazy in any way, and he made good decisions. He worked with local African chieftains. He kept with his privateer commission. For example, if he captured a British slave ship that might have had 12 enslaved people on board, and then 13 grumetas. These were African free workers, helping with the slave trade, and he freed them. He didn't, enslave any of them. That was not consistent with his commission. He, most of the crew came from where he was from, in North Kingstown and Exeter, Rhode Island. So people knew him and they respected him. Most of the officers as well. And they did him future voyages in addition.
Another great story that you tell in Dark Voyage is the how the Marlborough begins its journey. 1777 came to a close, and both Philadelphia and Newport were occupied by the British Army and the Royal Navy. In Newport, Brown and Babcock had to find a way to get the Marlborough out of the Narragansett Bay. Tell us a little bit about their maneuvers there.
Sure. The Britain.
This is a great story, by the way.
Well, the British Army captured Newport from a naval expeditionary force in December 1776 and stayed there till October 1779. And the first thing they did when they got there was to impose a blockade. Narragansett Bay has 3 channels. 2 of them are very deep water, which is why Narragansett Bay is an important naval area. The third one's called the Secana River today, Secana Channel, and it's pretty shallow. So the British only had 1 ship there, and it carried 14 guns. They did have some artillery posts as well. So what the Americans would do was they wait for a dark and stormy night. And this one that the Marlborough went down was actually on Christmas Eve. So they waited for one, a dark and stormy night. Suddenly they're going down, and bang, the ship gets stuck and grounded on a sand bar. So that's pretty scary. Babcock could have decided, throw the cannons overboard, throw all the stores overboard, all the food, and we'll just have to go back to Providence. But he didn't do that. So he got out. It must have been high tide coming in, knowing he would get off eventually. And he had small boats out there pulling, and finally got off. Then proceeded down. He was spotted by artillery. Artillery fired, so that alerted the British ship. But his ship was a superior sailing vessel, and it outdistanced the British ship. So he was able to escape. That wasn't true for all the other ships. Some of them were caught and destroyed by the British.
So this is going on when Washington and his troops are in Valley Forge. One of the amazing things about studying the American Revolution is that we sort of view this as a series of actions: Lexington and Concord, the Battle of New York, the Battle of the 10 Crucial Days in Trenton and Princeton, the Philadelphia campaign, the Monmouth campaign, all these land actions. And when you really learn about what happened during the years of the American Revolution, you have all these glorious land actions that we know all about. But one of the things that I love about Dark Voyage, and Eric J. Dolan's book that recently came out, Rebels at Sea, there's Donald Shawmut's book on the privateers off the coast of New Jersey. There actually were quadruple the number of actions at sea than there were on land. And that's one of the things that I absolutely love about this book, that you lose yourself in learning about what some of the things that were going on at sea that we've never read about before. And I think it's a terrific addition to everybody's library. So explain the net result of these American privateers on the British slave trade overall. What was the British slave? You mentioned at the beginning of the program, British slave trade was at its apex, really, right at Lexington and Concord. 8 years later, what's going on?
Well, it's more like 3 years later, in 1778.
Yeah.
In 1777. Marlborough hurt the British slave trade more than any other American privateer. So, and I go through that. And I do want to add another interesting aspect of the Marlborough's work on the coast was that they came across some African chieftains who were intermediaries. These guys were, had worked decades with British slave ships and American slave ships, and helping to get them slaves. And suddenly this one very prominent one called King Tom is helping the Americans and telling them what they should do. And, it just shows certain independence on their part, that they weren't going to be cowed by Britain. But it also shows, they get money from anyone, they'll do anything. But I also have a chapter on the American privateers capturing not just the Marlborough, but most of the American privateers that captured slave ships did so off the Caribbean islands, and they would intentionally look for slave ships. And this is the first book to really detail this. The privateers would pop out of French Caribbean colonies and only sail for an hour or two. These British slave ships were just about to arrive at Barbados and Jamaica and Antigua. After more than a year of slaving and being away from England, they're going to make tons of money. Bang, they're captured by American privateers. And I have one appendix that goes through, it's a narrative appendix. 26 slave ships were captured by American privateers with no slaves on board. So those are ones either going to Africa or coming from the Caribbean. One of them going to Africa was attacked, and it was a fierce engagement, and the British ship blew up. A lucky shot hit its gunpowder. I also have another appendix, 41 captures of British slave ships with slaves on board, 11,000 African captives on board. So just an amazing number. And the British investors back in Liverpool, mostly London, Bristol, hey, we're getting killed here. We're losing tons of money. These American privateers are really hurting us. We're not going to invest any more money in the slave trade. So not only did the American privateers disrupt the slave trade, they put practically almost an end to it. It went down by 70% in 1778, 1779, even more. This was before the French got involved, 1777, 1778. I estimate that because of the activities of the American privateers, as many as 60,000 African captives were not brought over from Africa to the British Caribbean. That's pretty impressive. Now, was it intentional? No, it was an unintended consequence of what the American privateers were doing. Was it permanent? No, it was temporary, but it's something.
So, James asked, or one of our in the audience asked, was there any connection off the New Jersey coast in your book? I don't remember the Marlborough ever coming down off the Jersey coast, but I did. What was there anything in there? I don't remember anything.
There was one prize ship that they got captured. So one of the prize ships that the Marlborough captured was captured by a British warship. They were brought into Antigua. Antigua didn't have any jails, and the British said, all right, you Americans, we'll send you back to New York, but you have to sail the ship, okay?
Right.
Oh, sure, we'll do that. So then the Americans get to Egg Harbor, which is a very popular privateering outpost in New Jersey. When they were passing that, they rebelled, took over the ship, and sailed the ship into Egg Harbor.
Harbor, that's right. I do remember that. So I did put in the chat for let's see, who was it? James, yeah. The Amazon link to Donald Shamet's book called Privateers of the Revolution. This is the book that is specifically about the actions of the privateers off the Jersey coast. So you can learn a lot from it. That's a wonderful book.
Yeah, good book.
So I highly recommend that. So last question here, how should we view these privateersmen? Were they heroes? Were they villains? What?
Well, it's tough. I mean, you can't deny that these privateersmen were out for profit, and profit in this sense meant capturing British slave ships, taking the captives they found on board and selling them for profit. They didn't care about the trauma they had suffered and going across the Atlantic or being taken away from their families and friends in Africa. So you can't escape that, and that's obviously horrible. On the other hand, there was this unintended consequence that because they did so much harm to the British slave trade, they intentionally attacked the British slave trade, that they disrupted it and really reduced it for a number of years during the war. So in that sense, they were heroes. They did, again, at least 60,000, probably more African captives were not brought over. And that wasn't just a temporary difference. I think a lot of that was a permanent difference.
Well, that's terrific. Well, before we close up here, I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of a commercial on some of the work that I've been doing with some of my colleagues. As some of you may know, I am executive producer to a musical about the revolution in development. And this is something that we started pre-COVID. There was a Broadway composer and lyricist who came down to Trenton and Princeton, and my partner Larry Kidder and I gave them a tour, and they went off and wrote this what we thought was a terrific musical, just called The Crossing in the 10 Crucial Days. And we've done a few readings and showings of this while we're trying to develop the musical. It really is, and it is not like Hamilton. It's not all hip hop. Although I loved Hamilton, I thought it was great. But this is more traditional musical, and we're developing this really for schools, because as we head on to our semi-quincentennial here, we think that this would be a wonderful vehicle to teach students about the ideals of enlightenment and the causes of the revolution. And if you want to go to thecrossingmusical.com, you can hear some of the music. It really is focused a lot on Thomas Paine. It talks about not just the soldiers and the fighting, it talks about the women, it talks about the Black soldiers who were involved in the revolution. And I'm very proud of this work, and we're moving forward with this. So if you go to thecrossingmusical.com, you can see some videos and hear some of the music that we're developing for this musical. So you're going to hear more about this. The reason why I explain this is that I have a program coming up where I'm going to invite John Allen Watts, who is the composer, to be a guest on History Author Talks. So he's not an author, he's a composer. But I think for my audience, I think that this would be something that would be of interest to hear why he came up. He and Jason Musa, who was the lyricist, came up with this, and I thought it would be a lot of fun. So that show is coming up on History Author Talks. I don't have a date yet, but it'll be coming up soon. And of course, we're moving into the fall where there's a lot happening with the American Revolution. This weekend, I head down to Brandywine for the Brandywine reenactment. With that, I want to thank Christian for his time tonight and this wonderful book, which is available at History Author Talks. You can find not only Dark Voyage, but all of Christian's books for sale, or wherever books are sold. I encourage everyone to take a look at all of the books that are on the History Author Talks bookshop. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you very much. Take care. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.